It began with the kind of charged silence that only comes before a storm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With the calm precision of someone who had been waiting for the perfect moment, she leaned forward, her eyes steady, and dropped the kind of sentence that cut straight through the air like a razor. You could feel the shift in the room. The energy changed. Everyone knew something had just happened, but no one was quite ready for what came next. She wasn't throwing shade. This wasn't gossip or political theater. What she said was deliberate, calculated, and deeply personal. And it was clear this wasn't some cheap shot. It came from a place of knowing. She had facts, receipts, a calm confidence that only someone with truth on their side can carry. And as soon as she said it, the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. The moment didn't even need a dramatic pause. She just said it, quietly, casually, but it was like a live wire hitting the floor. People on set exchanged glances. Hosts shifted in their chairs. A camera operator even flinched. It was the kind of moment you couldn't script, because it felt too real, too raw. And as the words hung there, suspended in the heavy air, the reaction came fast. A heartbeat passed, maybe two, and then came the scramble. There was a blink, a staggered breath, the forced attempt at a chuckle, a deflection. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Because she hadn't just made a statement, she had detonated a truth bomb, and there was no putting the pieces back together after that. The personal nature of what she revealed was what made it so powerful. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was authentic. It wasn't about salacious detail, it was about contradiction. She illuminated a crack in a carefully polished image, exposing a disconnect between the persona projected in public and the reality that lived behind. Closed doors. And for a moment it felt like the mask slipped. All the spin, all the talking points, all the armor, gone. Just a person, vulnerable, exposed, and for once without a comeback. She didn't gloat. That's what made it even more brutal. There was no smirk, no self-congratulation, no gotcha energy. She just moved on like it was a footnote. That, in itself, was masterful. It wasn't about scoring points. It was about saying, I see you, and so does everyone else now. What struck the audience, both in the studio and at home, was how quiet the response was. Not just from the one on the receiving end, but from the entire set. Normally, these discussions are filled with overtalk, rebuttals, and noise. But not this time. No one jumped in to change the subject. No one tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. They all felt it. That moment where someone finally says what's been sitting on everyone's mind, but no one had the nerve to say out loud. And the beauty of her approach was in its simplicity. She didn't come with theatrics or drama. She came with poise, with control. That made it even harder to recover from. There's no defense against the truth when it's delivered that calmly. It lingers. It echoes. It plays on a loop in your mind long after the cameras stop rolling. What she did in that short moment was redefine the conversation. It wasn't about policy anymore. It wasn't about debate. It became a moment of revelation, one that made people rethink everything. They thought they knew. The audience didn't just hear what she said, they felt it. And when the truth hits that deep, there's no taking it back. It didn't take long. As soon as the words landed, something shifted, visibly, unmistakably. There was an immediate change in posture, in tone, in the rhythm of speech. The calm demeanor cracked like glass under pressure. Eyes widened, lips parted for a breath that didn't quite make it out smoothly. It was as if someone had yanked the curtain back, and the person sitting there wasn't ready to be seen. Not like this. There was an attempt, quick, instinctive, to brush it off. A forced chuckle, a glance away, an attempt to pivot. But nothing stuck. The usual composure wasn't just shaken, it was shattered. What followed was less of a response, and more of a reaction, a reflexive, chaotic scramble to regain control of a conversation that had already slipped away. The words came out fast. Too fast. tripping over themselves, stumbling into half-formed sentences and awkward tangents. It was a verbal storm, loud, scattered, and transparent in its desperation. There was pointing, literal or metaphorical. Blame was flung in all directions, like sparks from a frayed wire, but none of it landed. The more the reaction grew, the clearer it became. This wasn't confidence. This was someone spiraling in real time. What made it even more jarring was the contrast. Just minutes before, there had been control, sharpness, the polished rhythm of someone used to being in command of every syllable. But now, that rhythm was gone. The message became a mess of contradictions and deflections. The voice rose, not in strength but in volume, as if shouting could somehow rewrite the moment. But shouting only made it worse. Every attempt to strike back missed the mark. Instead of addressing what was said, the reaction turned erratic. The focus shifted to side arguments, irrelevant anecdotes, personal jabs that fell flat. And through it all, there was that unmistakable undertone, panic disguised as outrage. That's what made it so obvious. This wasn't about setting the record straight. This was about survival in the spotlight, about trying to claw back a sense of control that had just been torn away. What happened next was even more telling. The attempt to redirect, classic move, shift the subject, ask a rhetorical question, accuse the other side of deflection, ironically while deflecting. But the audience wasn't buying it. The viewers weren't blind. They saw the unraveling for what it was. No matter how many times the conversation was steered off course, the damage had already been done. The sweat started to show, not literally maybe, but in the energy. In the rushed tone, the sudden interruptions, the jittery cadence. It was like watching a person outrun their own thoughts, hoping to stay one step ahead of a truth they didn't want to face. And the harder they tried to run, the more obvious it became that they were losing ground. What once sounded authoritative now sounded defensive, and then it crossed a line, from defensive to unhinged. There was no more logic to it, just noise, words thrown like fists in the dark. The fury wasn't rooted in confidence, it was rooted in exposure. And that's what made the meltdown so undeniable. It wasn't just about being challenged, it was about being cornered and realizing too late that there was no way out. What the audience witnessed wasn't just a debate gone wrong, it was a live, unfiltered moment of breakdown. Not dramatic in a theatrical way, but in the small, involuntary ways that reveal everything. The darting eyes, the dry throat, the repeated phrases that kept returning like a security blanket that had lost its warmth. It wasn't planned. It wasn't strategic. It was raw reaction, laid bare under the lights. People watching from home didn't need a commentator to explain what they were seeing. It was written in every strained syllable, every flustered gesture. This was no longer a conversation. It was a retreat disguised as rebuttal. And the person at the center of it all was unraveling, not because of what had been said, but because it wasn't about the surface-level drama. It was never just a stray comment or a sensational moment designed for ratings. What made it hit so hard, what made people lean forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the screen, was the deeper implication behind it. It was the kind of truth that's been hiding in plain sight, carefully avoided, danced around, and politely ignored. But now, someone had dared to say it. And not just say it with clarity, intention, and timing that made it impossible to ignore. What was revealed wasn't scandal for scandal's sake. It was a detail, small, perhaps to some, but laced with meaning. It pulled back the curtain on a carefully managed image, the kind that's been cultivated over years, sold to the public through speeches, sound bites, and media appearances. It was a reminder that behind every polished figure, every suit and tie, there's a personal reality that doesn't always match the narrative. The revelation spoke to contradiction, not in a loud, accusatory way, but in a quiet, undeniable fashion. It pointed to a disparity between the values being preached and the choices being made in private. And that kind of exposure is powerful, not because it's explosive, but because it resonates. People understand it. They've seen it before, in leaders, in celebrities, in their own lives, someone saying one thing while living another, and when that inconsistency is laid bare, it causes a ripple that goes far beyond the room it was said in. What made the moment so striking was the reaction it triggered, not just in the person it was directed at, but in everyone watching. There was a shift. People suddenly saw things differently. It wasn't just about policy or performance anymore. It became personal, human, flawed. The mythos around the individual started to fray, and what was left was something far more complex, and in many ways, far less admirable. The power in what was revealed lay not in the detail itself, but in what it symbolized. It was a mirror held up to a larger pattern. The idea that what's projected to the world might be more about image than authenticity. That speeches and sound bites can only mask so much. That eventually the truth finds its way to the surface, even if it's just a sliver. And sometimes, that sliver is all it takes to unravel the rest. Viewers could feel the weight of it. It didn't need to be shouted. It didn't require dramatic music or flashing headlines. It stood on its own. And in doing so, it invited people to re-examine everything they thought they knew, to look back at old interviews, old statements, and see them in a new light. It was like a puzzle suddenly making sense once the missing piece was snapped into place. What followed wasn't chaos or immediate fallout. It was quieter than that, more dangerous in a way. A lingering doubt, a question that didn't go away. It stuck with people. It raised eyebrows, shifted opinions, changed the way future words would be heard. Because once trust is shaken, even slightly, it's almost impossible to restore it fully. People start to wonder what else they haven't been told. What other truths have been tucked away behind curated appearances and calculated messaging? And the one who delivered the revelation? There was a certainty there. A calm, almost indifferent tone, like they weren't interested in drama. They were interested in honesty. That only added to the credibility. When someone doesn't need to shout to make their point, it tends to hit harder. It becomes harder to dismiss, harder to frame as an attack, because it doesn't feel like one. It feels like a light turned on in a room that had been kept dim for too long. This wasn't about trying to ruin someone. It wasn't a takedown. It was something far more impactful, an unveiling. A reminder that personal truth matters. That when you stand before the public and declare your ideals, your life behind the scenes should echo those same values. And if it doesn't, sooner or later, someone is going to call it out, not with fury, but with facts. The internet didn't just react, it erupted. Within minutes, clips were circulating on every platform imaginable. Phones buzzed with notifications, timelines flooded with reactions, and hashtags climbed to the top of trending lists like wildfire in a dry forest. The moment had crossed the threshold from political confrontation to full-blown cultural phenomenon. People weren't just watching, they were living it, sharing it, and dissecting every second of it with collective awe. What stood out was the speed and intensity of the response. In an age where attention spans flicker and news cycles refresh, by the hour, this moment cut through the noise with surgical precision. It wasn't just because of what was said, it was how it was said. Calm, poised, unshakable. The kind of delivery that instantly separates someone from the crowd and places them in a different category altogether. Not just a speaker, but a force. Memes appeared within minutes, each one sharper than the last. Screenshots of the expression that followed the unexpected reveal went viral, paired with captions that turned a live moment into a digital anthem. The reaction wasn't just shock, it was admiration. People across the spectrum could feel it. This wasn't performance, it was truth in its purest form. And truth, when delivered without fear, tends to have a gravitational pull. Comment sections overflowed with praise, not for theatrics or aggression, but for clarity. It was a rare display of composure under pressure, of someone stepping into the storm and walking through it untouched. That kind of unbothered confidence is magnetic, especially in a time when so many voices on screen seem scripted, rehearsed, and filtered. This was the opposite, raw in its honesty, yet precise in its execution. It wasn't long before commentators weighed in. Podcasts dissected the moment frame by frame. YouTubers broke it down with reaction videos, pausing to emphasize facial expressions, tone shifts, and the silence that followed the unexpected statement. Even those who might not have agreed with the politics couldn't help but respect the delivery. It was the kind of moment that transcended partisanship and tapped into something universal: courage, clarity, and unapologetic truth. Social media crowned a new icon that day. The titles rolled in fast: Queen of Composure, Truth Sniper, The Calm Before the Storm. People began reposting old interviews, finding other moments of subtle strength, building a timeline of someone who had been quietly preparing for a moment like this all along. It was as if the world had just noticed what had always been there, and once the spotlight hit, there was no turning it off. And perhaps most powerful of all was the silence from the other side. No immediate statements, no attempts to reframe the situation. Just a digital vacuum where there had once been dominance. It spoke volumes. Sometimes the loudest reaction is no reaction at all. A kind of stunned paralysis that reveals just how deep the moment cut. Silence can be an admission, and in this case, it echoed louder than any defense ever could. The cultural resonance didn't stop there. Late-night shows referenced the moment with sharp monologues and well-timed applause lines. Artists began sketching interpretations of the scene. Even in spaces far removed from politics, fashion, music, sports, there were nods to what had just taken place. Because when someone stands in truth with that much presence, it becomes more than politics. It becomes mythos. And through all of it, the one at the center didn't boast, didn't follow up with a media tour, didn't stoke the flames. They simply let the moment speak for itself. That restraint added fuel to the fire. In a world addicted to reaction, silence can be the most powerful amplifier. The message had landed. The world had heard it. And now, without saying another word, the person who had delivered it watched the impact ripple outward like waves from a single, perfectly thrown stone. As the dust settled and the clip continued to circulate across networks and social feeds, one thing became undeniably clear. Something shifted that day. It wasn't just a viral moment or another segment in the endless scroll of political discourse. It was a turning point, a moment where authenticity pierced through the carefully crafted facades that so often dominate public conversation. And when truth hits that hard, it doesn't quietly fade away. It leaves a mark. What unfolded wasn't about scoring cheap points or manufacturing outrage. It was about someone having the courage to speak with unshakable clarity, to call out what others had avoided, and to do it without flinching. It wasn't the volume of the words that shook the room. It was the weight of their meaning. That's why people couldn't stop watching. That's why the reaction was immediate, visceral, and widespread. The truth, when spoken plainly and without apology, has a way of cutting through everything else. The silence that followed the reveal wasn't just about shock. It was the collective recognition that a line had been crossed, not by aggression or disrespect, but by honesty that could no longer be denied. In that moment, the stage belonged to the one who had nothing to hide, nothing to fear, and nothing to prove. That kind of presence doesn't come from rehearsed sound bites. It comes from conviction. And conviction, when it's real, has power. This wasn't just a takedown. It wasn't about humiliation or dominance. It was about exposure. It was about holding a mirror up to a system that so often relies on illusions, contradictions, and curated reputations. And when that mirror reflected something inconvenient, something out of alignment, it shook the room, not because people didn't suspect it, but because someone finally said it out loud. That's what made it resonate so deeply. Not just the facts, but the delivery. Calm, measured, controlled. In an environment where most people try to shout the loudest, this was different. It was precise, surgical. There was no screaming, no need to raise a voice, because when the truth is that clear, it doesn't need volume. It just needs space to be heard. In the days that followed, the ripple effects continued. More people started asking questions. More began to reassess what they thought they knew. That's the beauty of a moment rooted in truth. It doesn't have to fight for longevity. It lasts because people recognize something real when they see it, and once that door is opened, it's hard to close it again. This wasn't just a broadcast. It was a reminder. A reminder that real strength isn't in controlling the narrative, it's in standing firmly in the truth no matter who's watching. And on that day, someone did exactly